a good story will have a strong structure. Now we talk about structure in week 4, so I'm not going to go over all of those points there, but I do want to identify a couple of things which I see in new writing which I think will help you to evaluate your own story and decide whether it's strong or could be strengthened further. The first thing is the opening. I see a lot of fiction starts with quite long-winded introductions or explanations of context or descriptions of setting, and that is not a strong way to start a piece of fiction. The old advice given is to start with the action. Now some people think that means you need to start with something exciting like an explosion or a volcano going off, or a house on fire or something, but that's not what that means. What it means is you decide what your character's up to and what they are doing and start with that. So even if you have a whole lot of knowledge about a character who might be a little old lady, recently widowed, living in a retirement village, new and got no friends, and her dog's just died, or whatever it is, you might know all that, but you don't start with that. You start with what that character's doing. So maybe that character is up in the middle of the night looking out the window and she sees her neighbour burying something in the backyard. That is the action of the story. That's what you start with. You may have to thread some of that other information into the story to provide context for the reader, but don't sort of provide it all at the start, because it's not that interesting, and it's not going to grab your reader by the throat. So that opening thing with the action should say to your reader, oh, why is she looking out the window? Why is he digging in the garden? So there's a kind of action that creates an engagement in the reader. So that's the number one thing I'd like you to look at when you review your stories is it starting in the right place? Are you starting with that action? The second point I'd like to make is the conclusion. The conclusion has to sort of be the culmination, if you like, of all the other story elements. So you have this thing, where you've got a character who wants something, that there's obstacles in their way or there's conflict in their life. They get to a crisis point where they make a heap of decisions, and then there's all this stuff that falls out of the crisis and leads to a denouement. So Mrs. MacDonald, my little old lady who's lonely, may end up exposing a bad guy, and as a result the rest of the village sort of sees what she's up to and she gets a whole lot of friends out of it. So it kind of has that story arc where things happen and are resolved. What happens for a lot of people with new writing, though, is they tell this story from one character's point of view. That's the story arc. I'm waving around, sorry. But when they get to the ending, they'll switch to someone else's point of view. So if I use my example, we tell the story all through Mrs. MacDonald's thoughts and feelings and what she does, and then in that last paragraph a writer will switch to, say, the bad neighbour's point of view, the one who buried the bones in the garden. Don't do it. If you read through your story and you review it and you see that you've changed point of view in that last paragraph, go back and rework your story so that you reveal that ending through your main character, your main narrator's voice. It's a really important thing. If you switch that voice, if you switch characters right at the end, it throws the reader out of the fictional dream, and that's just not what you want. And the third point I just want to mention briefly here is that new writers will sometimes bracket a story, and by that I mean they will have a narrator telling someone else's story within the story. So they might have somebody in a hospital bed and a patient comes in, and then the first person who's mentioned, Mrs. Jones in the hospital bed, here I am feeling grumpy and alone, and then another person comes in and tells their story to Mrs. Jones. And so Mrs. Jones, so you've got the author introducing Mrs. Jones, who then tells the third party story, and so there's that in the middle, and then the final paragraph will be Mrs. Jones thinking, well, that was interesting, or whatever else. If you find you've done that, toss it out. Just tell the story of the person in the middle bed. That's the real story, and that's the one you want to tell. There is a place for that kind of double narrated a story, I suppose you'd call it, but in a very short fiction, that's a waste of words. So focus on the main story and make sure that's the one that you're telling. So 3 points. Start with the action, with the character's action, the main action that starts the story off. end in the main character's point of view. Don't switch off to another character, and don't use a kind of narrating character to tell another character's story. If you do that, you're going to have a story that starts and ends more strongly.